Rolex. For all the hype, for all the talk, I've never actually had access to one before. Yeah, I've tried on a few of those showroom models that aren't for sale at authorized dealers, but not only have I never owned one, but I've never had anyone in my life who has owned one either. Well, that's not entirely true. I did know a guy who had a Wimbledon dial white Datejust a couple years ago, but he only had it for 2 or 3 weeks before he traded it in for a Grand Seiko, and that was the end of that. But generally, I haven't had any real access to Rolex, vintage or new, until now. So what changed? A friend of mine, Rachel, who knows about my channel but isn't personally into watches, inherited her grandfather's mid-90s era reference number 14060 Submariner. When she told me about it, one of the first things she said was I could borrow it for a video if I liked. I didn't even have to ask. Now that's a friend. I don't think Rachel understands how much I appreciate this. At that point, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what the reference number was, and I had no idea what kind of condition it was in either. All I knew was it was an older sub that her grandfather purchased in the mid-90s. And a lot can happen to a watch over 25 to 30 years. I need not have worried, because this thing is a beauty, and it's in very, very good condition. Obviously, this is a pre-ceramic sub, but there isn't a hint of a scratch or mark on the bezel, or even the case and lugs for that matter. I wonder how much it's actually been worn because it's nearly flawless. It's kind of funny to me that one of my really good friends who isn't into watches at all ends up inheriting one of the best watches I've ever seen. Historically, I've never been a big fan of the Submariner. It's too big, and I don't like the fit and feel of the super case. I've always gravitated to the 36mm Explorer, and I also really like the 36mm Datejust with a fluted bezel. But the modern day sub is just too big for me to pay much attention to on a personal level. But this is a whole different beast altogether. First of all, it has about half the dial text of the current sub. One of my biggest issues with the sub is all that unnecessary text. Also, it wears quite a bit smaller. It's a 40mm case, but it wears more like a 38 or a 39. It's 12.5mm tall, and the lug-to-lug distance is a somewhat petite 47.5mm. And I think that's why this one wears so much smaller than the current reference. This is a wearable iteration for women, and the current reference really isn't suitable for most girls with average-sized wrists. Now, I'm not a Rolex expert, but it's my understanding that some of the earlier models of the 14060 had tritium lume, but this is all Luminova, and it's still working very well all these years later. As near as I can tell, there's little to no wear on this watch, no signs of polishing at all. This thing is just beautiful, and I am totally enamored with it. Now, of course, this watch belongs to a friend, so I only wore it for filming purposes. But when I did wear it, I found myself looking down at it constantly. This is everything I like about vintage Tudor subs, but so much more. When I look at this watch, I feel like something has been lost. It has this older world charm that I like so much more than the current reference. Still, it's a good blend between old and new. The smaller size, the vintage aesthetic blended with the practicality of a sapphire crystal, and the agelessness of white gold hands and indices. This watch is somewhere around 25 to 30 years of age. Theoretically, I could have popped it open to narrow it down, but again, it's not my watch and I'm not going to do that. But I do wonder, what will it look like in 25 to 30 more years if it's properly cared for? I own a Tudor, I own an Omega, and I own a Grand Seiko. I think they're great watches, but what will they look like 25 to 30 years from now? Or 50 to 60? I have some creeping doubt that they will hold up as well as this has. Most of my thoughts about Rolex have been theoretical because I haven't had any real experience with them. But this is eye-opening. This is a high-quality timepiece. Based on the model number, this should have the old 27 jewel automatic caliber 3000. This is a pre-Kosk movement, but people also swear by this movement in the forums. A lot is made of ETA and Seiko having, quote, workhorse movements. But this is a true workhorse movement. Now, I don't know what the history is in terms of servicing, but the watch has been running about +5 to 6 seconds a day under my care. It's not a modern movement. There's no silicone hairspring, so I imagine it would be easy to accidentally magnetize it. But it's rugged, and it's supposed to be very shock resistant. I imagine with proper care and servicing, this watch could be running excellently 25 more years from now. I often shoot watches that have higher water resistance submerged in water. But again, this isn't my watch, so I didn't do that. But if it were, I would have. I have little to no doubt that the seals on this thing are fine. And again, I find myself buying into the Rolex mystique. Go swimming, don't worry, it's a Rolex. But those are just my feelings about it. Rachel, if you're watching this, do not go swimming without getting it checked out first. This thing is way too nice to take a chance. I admit I had some reservations about doing a video with a friend's century-old Rolex, but this has been a revelation. I get it. This is why people who don't care a whit about status still end up buying a Rolex. The bracelet isn't quite as wonderful as the watch, but it's not bad either. Hollow links and end links, it's light but a bit jangly, and it's all satin polish, giving it a no-nonsense tool watch vibe. It has a flip-lock pull-out diver extension and several micro-adjusts as well. By today's standard, it's not the most impressive bracelet, but it's solid enough and I like how light it is. The lack of heft contributes to wearability for those of us who have undersized wrists. But hey, if you don't like the bracelet, then the drilled lugs make putting it on strap a snap. And there are few watches in this world that are as versatile as a sub for wearing different straps. I like vintage watches, but I've always had misgivings about how reliable they might end up being. And that has stopped me from pulling the trigger more than a few times on a nice piece. Spending time with this Rolex has been confidence-inspiring. There is room in my collection for something similar, and I'm much more likely to research and pursue such a purchase than I was beforehand. Rolex can be a polarizing brand for so many. First, you have the uneducated and uninterested public that just assumes that Rolex is the best watch manufacturer, period. Then you have the Rolex fanboys who actually know quite a bit about Rolex, but they cannot allow any legitimate criticism of their sacred cow. Next, we have the people who irrationally hate Rolex, and there's plenty of them. And I guess lastly, there are so many of us who like some of the watches that Rolex makes, but hate the consequences of the brilliant marketing that Rolex has deployed over the decades that make it near impossible for you to purchase a new Rolex at the actual retail price. I'm on 2 separate wait lists for a new Rolex, and I'm beginning to wonder if vintage Rolex makes more sense. There is so much to explore in the Rolex canon, and if I like this watch that just sort of dropped into my lap, how much might I end up loving some other reference that I have no actual knowledge of right now? I definitely have a lot to think about, but in the meantime, I can be happy for my friend and her beautiful watch, and grateful that I got to experience it a little bit, because I think this has opened another doorway in my watch journey. And I'm also grateful that I got to share it with all of you.